Hello and welcome to our ESG series of Instant Insights. I'm Amalia Maiden.
And I'm Martina Raveni.
And this series explores the topic of ESG, discussing why this theme is more than just hype for the future of businesses and taking a brief look into the latest news headlines of interest.
Welcome back everyone to our ESG series. It's great to have you here with us once again. Now, Amalia, let me start this episode by saying that climate change, sustainability, workplace diversification are not particularly new or revolutionary topics, to be fair. ESG has been a corporate topic that dates back over 2 decades and is said to be one of the key critical themes impacting businesses over the next one. Indeed, we all know and have largely accepted its importance. The laws are being made, the news is constantly talking about it. But now the question is, why aren't we tangibly seeing the sustainable changes that governments and higher authorities keep telling us are actually happening?
Well, Marty, you're right. There seems to be a great disparity between what's being talked about by governments and politicians in the news and what people are actually seeing in their workplaces and daily lives. In fact, the latest ESG sentiment polls reported by Global Data for Q2 this year revealed that 47% of people responding thought that most companies just treat ESG as a marketing exercise. Now, this is an opinion that definitely reflects with the confusion and frustration felt by many people over the recent attitude towards sustainable issues. This outdated corporate approach towards all aspects of environmental, social, and positive change has for many felt exhausting, with the brunt of responsibility being placed upon the consumer to make the conscious decisions and to financially motivate companies to prioritise sustainable practices.
Yeah, that's very true. That doesn't seem fair given the mass of other pressures consumers currently face when making financial decisions and purchases. Particularly if you think about, just to name a few, about the cost of living crisis, the fuel prices skyrocketing, and all we've seen this past year.
Exactly. And whilst this consumer movement to push sustainability to the forefront of decisions has been highly successful at increasing the awareness over the urgency of climate change, its momentum has now clearly seen a decline, particularly in the face of these other pressing issues that you've mentioned. So now is the time for governments to usher in a new era of ESG, an ESG 2.0, if you like, that will sustain the momentum of this sustainable movement that the consumers have helped to create. So it's probably best, Marty, if we start off by explaining a bit about what we mean by ESG 2.0.
Yeah, sure. So, it's important to keep clear here that ESG 2.0 still focuses on the core issues of the environmental, social, and governance factors of a business and all its operations. However, in this, I can call it second phase, there will be a greater focus on the E component of ESG, with a shift from this theme being a voluntary regime to a mandatory one. I mean that this change will be driven by government mandates rather than consumer pressure, with a host of new environmental laws in the pipeline relating to mandatory reporting, carbon pricing, and carbon import tariffs. And this is going to be paired with more state support and investment in clean energy technologies.
And a core issue of what needed to be eliminated from the old regime was that nasty practice of company profiteering off of greenwashing.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt you, but before going on, could you quickly clarify to our listeners what greenwashing actually means?
So this was where companies exaggerate their environmental and ethical credentials to boost customer loyalty. And the EU is now acting as the people's protector in this fight. It's introducing new legislation that will both deter companies from future greenwashing activities and also hold them accountable to the claims that they've already been making. Now, much of the current regulatory focus has been on the financial sector, with sustainable financial disclosure regulation aiming to regulate the use of ESG terms within corporate filings. And with this regulation, the use of terms such as green or sustainable will only be allowed for products that meet clear, set definitions, and therefore this aims to prevent companies from falsely labelling the investment opportunities as sustainable to attract greater investment.
Okay, so you mentioned sustainable investments and product, but Could you give our listeners a more real-world example what you mean by prod here?
Yeah, so this, for example, is when you're picking your pension fund or your bank, the company that you choose your bank through, quite often people are now also considering whether the investments that they're making into this company, whether this company is doing the right thing for the environment. So are they investing in green projects, such as planting trees, such as renewable energy? And what we're looking at with this Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation is that they're going to regulate to ensure that when companies say that their investments that they're using your money with are green or sustainable, that they do actually have a positive outcome for the climate mission.
Yeah, that's a very good example. So basically, these disclosures are adding transparency, making more difficult for companies to, in a way, exaggerate sustainability performance. Do you mean that?
Exactly. And similarly, the EU Green Claims Directive, proposed in March 2023, will require that any ESG-related advertising claims are now also to be backed up by an independent verifier. So this also is greatly going to help reduce the ease of greenwashing for consumer-focused corporations in particular. However, as these changes are introduced, there will also be a period of quiet where companies reduce the amount of green claims that they're making, mainly out of fear of the new consequences that they're going to face for their unbacked claims.
Okay, so this is why we are experiencing a lot of less noise from companies about their ESG strategies. Where this regulation that you talk about seems great from improving consumer confidence, it's also deterring companies in a way from quickly making loud and bold sustainable campaigns.
Yeah, so this quietening of sustainable marketing is known as greenwashing. And it's this transition away from greenwashing that can partly explain the confusion felt amongst many about the lack of tangible, sustainable action that they can observe around themselves in their workplaces and often now in their daily lives.
Yeah, so we can say that we'll see that it could take some time for companies to restructure their ESG strategies in order to align and comply with incoming government legislation.
Yeah, exactly, Marty.
Business marketing and claims are not the only aspects of corporate actions that need to be regulated for their sustainability. Indeed, a key focus has also been directed towards supply chain regulation and emissions offsetting. And this is the kind of change that it's featuring greatly in the news headlines at the moment, and it is a very hot topic with governments and politicians. So now let's talk about what the driving force for these changes have been.
Well, Marty, the driving factors for this have come from many sources, but mainly there has been the pressure from corporate stakeholders, particularly those with a focus on 2030 and beyond, because they're increasingly considering the threat of relying on unsustainable practices and what that will mean for their businesses.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Amalia. However, I think it's also important to point out here that nearly 40% of respondents to the ESG sentiment polls you mentioned before consider legislation and pressure from governments to be the primary reason for creating an ESG performance plan. And this has only shown an increasing trend of the past 6 months.
Yes, exactly. So this is the second key driving factor, and this is that governments have pledged towards 2050 and 2060 net zero targets. Now, net zero targets aim for the complete negation of greenhouse gases that are produced by human activity, and this is primarily achieved through emission reduction and CO2 reabsorption. And many governments are introducing legislation across all jurisdictions that will encourage investment and adoption of sustainable power and technology practices.
And what would this legislation mean for businesses?
Well, there'll be increasing expectations for companies to become accountable for not only the emissions that their businesses produce in its core operations, but also the emissions across its whole supply and value chain. And these are the Scope 3 emissions. In the EU, there's going to be higher tax mechanisms, such as carbon pricing, that will aim to financially incentivise both EU businesses and those hoping to trade within the EU single market to reduce their overall emissions in order to spend less on tax and reduce the amount of tax that they are charged.
Okay, to wrap up today's episode, we can say that companies will very much be needing to stay ahead of these legislation changes, not only to comply with the evolving government regulation, but also to meet the new sustainable expectations and desires from their stakeholders. And yeah, can you give our listeners a few takeaways?
Well, the key change here is that there's going to be a transition away from using sustainability and the term sustainability as a mask to attract greater business. And instead, we'll be moving towards a future with higher accountability and enforced regulation around the corporate actions that impact the environment. The financial incentives will still be available for businesses to operate with a focus on good ESG practices. However, these financial incentives will come from governments using legislation rather than consumers and their purchases. And therefore, these changes being made will not be as loud or as obvious as they once were. Companies who focus on sustainability as a core, honest focus within their operations will both benefit from these changes and develop a stronger outlook for success over the next decade.
Thank you very much, Amalia, for those instant insights.
Thanks, Marty.
Here at Instant Insight, we want to know more about which ESG topics interest you, so we have included a poll for this episode for our Spotify listeners.
Yes, for all our listeners, please do get in touch with us via the comments options or via this poll to also let us know what you found interesting. Yes, and for all our other listeners, please do get in touch with us via the comments option to also let us know what you found interesting. We look forward to finding out what topics you'd like to hear more about in the future.
And on behalf of all of us from Thematic Intelligence, thanks for listening.
And see you next time.